I'm Ashley, 24, and I thought coming home early from my business trip would be a pleasant surprise for my parents. Instead, I found them in my childhood bedroom, methodically packing my belongings into boxes while my stepbrother Derek lounged in the doorway, smirking as he directed them to be careful with Ashley's little keepsakes. When I demanded to know what was happening, my mother calmly explained they were helping me transition to independent living by moving me into a studio apartment they'd already rented, while Derek would be taking over my room to accommodate his growing family. What they didn't know was that their betrayal would expose the massive inheritance fraud they'd been committing for 6 years, and that by the time I was done, they'd lose everything they'd stolen from me and more. What do you think I should have done in that moment? Confronted them immediately? Played along to gather evidence? Or just walked away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to hit that like button and subscribe because this family betrayal story is about to get absolutely explosive. You won't believe what I discovered about my own inheritance and the lengths my family went to steal my future. To understand the devastating betrayal I walked into that day, you need to know about the carefully constructed family dynamic that had defined my life for the past 12 years. My father, Michael Harrison, had married my stepmother Patricia when I was 12, bringing her 15-year-old son Derek into our household and creating what everyone praised as a beautiful blended family. From the outside, we looked like the perfect modern American success story, a loving couple who'd merged their families seamlessly and created a harmonious home environment. The reality was far more complex and, as I would later discover, deliberately manipulative. Patricia was a master at creating the appearance of fairness while systematically favoring her biological son over me. She was subtle about it, never openly cruel or dismissive, but always finding ways to ensure that Derek received better treatment, more opportunities, and greater consideration in family decisions. My father, desperate to make his second marriage work after the painful divorce from my mother when I was 8, seemed willfully blind to these disparities. He was so grateful to have found love again and so committed to proving that blended families could succeed that he ignored obvious signs of favoritism and dismissed my complaints as normal teenage adjustment issues. When I pointed out that Derek got a larger allowance despite being older and supposedly more capable of earning his own money, Dad would lecture me about gratitude and family unity. Derek, for his part, was cunning enough to play the perfect stepson when adults were watching while making my life miserable when we were alone. He was 3 years older, physically larger, and socially confident in ways that I wasn't. He used these advantages to establish a household hierarchy where he was clearly the favored child and I was positioned as the problem that needed managing. He never hit me or engaged in obvious bullying, but he was expert at psychological manipulation and social undermining. The favoritism became more pronounced as we both entered high school. Derek was naturally athletic and charismatic, traits that my father admired and rewarded with expensive equipment, training camps, and constant praise. When Derek made varsity football as a sophomore, Dad bought him a car to reward his dedication and help him get to practice. When I made honor roll every semester and earned a partial academic scholarship to college, the reward was a modest dinner out and a lecture about how academic achievement was expected, not exceptional. College applications revealed the true extent of the family's double standard. Derek's mediocre grades and average test scores were excused because of his sports participation and leadership potential. My father hired an expensive college consultant to help Derek find schools that would accept him despite his academic shortcomings, while I was expected to navigate the application process largely on my own because my good grades meant I didn't need as much help. When Derek was accepted to a state university with a partial athletic scholarship, the family celebrated with a huge party and Dad bought him a new laptop, furniture for his dorm room, and set up a generous monthly allowance for living expenses. When I was accepted to a prestigious private college with significant academic merit aid, the response was more subdued. Dad congratulated me but immediately began discussing the financial burden my education would place on the family, despite the fact that my scholarship covered most of the costs. The messaging was clear: Derek's achievements were celebrated and rewarded, while mine were expected and came with lectures about fiscal responsibility. Derek's struggles were met with additional support and resources, while mine were treated as character-building challenges that I needed to overcome independently. The double standard was so consistent that I began to internalize the belief that I was somehow less deserving of support and investment than my stepbrother. College years provided some relief from the toxic family dynamics, but they also revealed how deeply the favoritism was embedded in long-term planning. When Derek struggled academically and socially at college, Dad immediately began providing additional financial support, paying for tutoring, counseling, and even a private apartment when Derek complained about his roommate. When I called home stressed about balancing work-study jobs with my demanding academic schedule, the advice was always to work harder and make better choices about time management. Derek's college experience was extended from 4 years to 6 as he changed majors multiple times and took reduced course loads to accommodate his social life. Throughout this period, Dad continued paying for his education, housing, and living expenses without complaint. Meanwhile, I graduated in 4 years with honors, maintained a part-time job throughout college, and graduated with minimal student debt due to my academic performance and careful financial management. After graduation, the disparities continued. Derek moved back home to figure out his career path and spent 2 years living rent-free while dabbling in various entry-level jobs that he would quit whenever the work became challenging. Dad supported this exploration phase financially and emotionally, often praising Derek's thoughtful approach to career development. When I took a demanding but lower-paying job at a nonprofit organization focused on environmental policy, the family's response was lukewarm. They were proud but concerned about my impractical career choice and its implications for my financial future. The housing situation became particularly galling. Derek was allowed to live at home rent-free well into his 20s, treating the house like a hotel while Dad and Patricia handled his laundry, meals, and household responsibilities. When I moved back home temporarily after a relationship ended and I needed to save money for a security deposit on my own place, I was immediately charged rent and given a list of household chores that were expected in addition to my full-time job. What I didn't realize at the time was that this differential treatment wasn't just about favoritism or family dynamics. It was part of a larger, more calculated plan that involved financial fraud, inheritance manipulation, and a level of betrayal that would have been unthinkable to me if I hadn't discovered the evidence myself. The family that I'd been trying so desperately to please and prove myself worthy of had been systematically stealing from me for years, using my desire for acceptance to blind me to their criminal behavior. The pattern of favoritism that had seemed like ordinary blended family challenges was actually the foundation for a much more sinister agenda. And the day I came home early from my business trip, I was about to discover just how far my father and stepmother had been willing to go to ensure that Derek's future was secured at the expense of my own. After discovering my parents packing my belongings without my consent, I demanded an immediate family meeting to understand what was happening. What unfolded over the next 2 hours was a masterclass in gaslighting, manipulation, and financial betrayal that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my family. Patricia and my father had prepared their talking points carefully, presenting my forced relocation as a loving intervention designed to help me develop independence and build character through self-reliance. "Ashley, sweetheart," Patricia said in her perfectly practiced concerned mother voice, "we've been watching you struggle to establish yourself as an independent adult, and we think living on your own will help you develop the confidence and life skills you need." The condescension was breathtaking, considering I'd been supporting myself through college, had maintained steady employment since graduation, and had only moved back home temporarily to save money for my own place. My father nodded along supportively, adding, "We've already put down a deposit on a nice studio apartment in a good neighborhood. It's perfect for a young professional, and the rent is very reasonable. We want to help you take this important step toward full independence." The fact that they'd made these arrangements without consulting me, while simultaneously giving my room to Derek and his pregnant girlfriend, revealed the true nature of their support. But the real bombshell came when I pressed them about the financial arrangements. Derek and his girlfriend Hannah would be moving into my childhood bedroom because they needed space for the baby and couldn't afford a larger apartment on Derek's sporadic income from his latest job at a car dealership. Meanwhile, I would be paying $1,200 per month for a 400-square-foot studio apartment, despite making only marginally more money than Derek and having significantly more student debt to manage. It's only fair, Patricia explained. Derek has a family to support now, and as the older child, he deserves to have established himself before taking on additional financial responsibilities. The twisted logic was stunning. Derek was 3 years older than me but had been financially dependent on our parents for his entire adult life, while I had been working and contributing to household expenses since I was 16. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of arguing further or accepting their manipulative gift of forced independence, I told them I needed time to process this information and would give them my decision in a few days. What I actually did was use those few days to hire a private investigator and start digging into my family's financial records, particularly regarding my inheritance from my maternal grandmother. My grandmother, Helen Morrison, had died when I was 18, just before I started college. She'd been a successful real estate investor who'd built a substantial portfolio over decades of careful property management and strategic investments. I knew she'd left me something in her will because my father had mentioned it several times over the years, always in the context of how lucky I was to have her foresight and generosity to help with my future. But when I requested copies of the will and estate documents from the probate court, what I discovered made my blood run cold. My grandmother hadn't just left me something, she'd left me nearly everything. Her estate, valued at $1.8 million, had been divided with 85% going to me and 15% going to my father, with the specific stipulation that my inheritance was to be held in trust until I turned 25, managed by my father as trustee, and used exclusively for my education, housing, and career development. The trust documents were crystal clear about the intended purpose of the money: to ensure that I would have the financial foundation to pursue my education and career goals without the burden of debt or financial stress that had limited my grandmother's own opportunities as a young woman. The trust was designed to pay for my college expenses, provide a down payment for my first home, and offer seed money for any business ventures or advanced education I might pursue. For 6 years, my father had been managing an inheritance worth over $1.5 million that was specifically designated for my benefit. And for 6 years, I had been working multiple jobs, taking out student loans, and living with constant financial stress while believing that my family was making sacrifices to support my education. The student loans I'd taken out to cover college expenses that weren't covered by my scholarship? Unnecessary. The work-study jobs that had exhausted me throughout college? Pointless. The financial anxiety that had influenced every major decision I'd made as a young adult? Completely manufactured. But the theft went deeper than simple neglect or mismanagement. The private investigator's preliminary report revealed that my father had been systematically transferring money from my trust account into investments and accounts that benefited Derek and the family's general expenses. He'd used my inheritance money to pay for Derek's extended college experience, his car, his living expenses, and most recently, the down payment on the house that Derek and Hannah were planning to buy after their baby was born. The studio apartment they were forcing me to move into? It was being paid for with my own inheritance money, while Derek lived rent-free in our family home that had been partially renovated using funds from my trust. The generous family support that had enabled Derek's comfortable lifestyle for the past 6 years? It was actually my money, stolen from the trust that was supposed to secure my financial future. The most infuriating discovery was that my 25th birthday was only 3 months away. In 3 months, the trust would legally transfer to my direct control, and my father's role as trustee would end. The forced move wasn't about helping me develop independence. It was about removing me from the house before I gained access to financial records that would expose their theft. They were trying to relocate me and establish a new normal where I wasn't living at home and wasn't involved in family financial discussions. The timing of Derek's sudden need for my bedroom wasn't coincidental either. By moving him and his pregnant girlfriend into my space, they were creating an emotional and practical barrier to my return. How could I displace a young family with a newborn baby? How could I seem so selfish as to prioritize my own housing needs over those of a new mother and child? It was a calculated move designed to make it socially and emotionally impossible for me to challenge the new living arrangements. Reading through 6 years of financial records, I realized that virtually every major family decision had been made with Derek's interests prioritized over mine, funded with money that legally belonged to me. His extended college years, his comfortable lifestyle, his ability to take unpaid internships and explore his options without financial pressure, all of it had been subsidized with the inheritance that was supposed to be securing my future. The pattern of favoritism I'd endured throughout my teens and early 20s wasn't just about personality conflicts or blended family dynamics. It was about systematically conditioning me to accept less while my inheritance was redirected to benefit Derek. Every lecture about fiscal responsibility, every suggestion that I needed to be more independent, every comparison between my expectations and Derek's gratitude had been designed to normalize a situation where I received less while Derek received more. As I sat in my car outside a coffee shop, reading through trust documents and financial records that painted a picture of systematic theft and betrayal, I realized that my family's surprise intervention was actually their panicked attempt to cover up years of criminal behavior. They hadn't been packing my things to help me transition to independence, they'd been removing me from the house before I could discover the truth about my stolen inheritance. The question now was what I was going to do with this information, and how I was going to make sure that the family who'd spent 6 years stealing my future would face the full consequences of their betrayal. The more I dug into the financial records with my private investigator, the more sophisticated and deliberate the theft became. This wasn't a case of poor financial management or misunderstanding the trust's terms, this was systematic embezzlement carried out over 6 years with meticulous documentation that revealed the full scope of my family's betrayal. My father, as a licensed CPA, had used his professional knowledge to create a complex web of transfers and investments designed to hide the theft of my inheritance. The trust account statements showed a pattern of regular withdrawals that coincided perfectly with Derek's major life events and expenses. When Derek needed a car during his junior year of college, $18,000 was withdrawn from my trust for educational transportation expenses. When he wanted to study abroad for a semester despite his poor grades, $25,000 was transferred to cover his program fees and living expenses abroad. When he decided to change majors for the 3rd time, requiring an additional year of college, another $30,000 was withdrawn to cover the extended tuition costs. But the educational expenses were just the beginning. My father had been using my inheritance to subsidize Derek's entire lifestyle, categorizing personal expenses as beneficiary development costs or trust administration fees. Derek's expensive gym membership was listed as health and wellness expenses for trust beneficiary family member. His spring break trips were recorded as cultural enrichment activities. Even his car insurance and cell phone bills were being paid from my trust account under various creative expense categories. The house renovations that had transformed our family home into a more luxurious property were another major drain on my inheritance. Over $80,000 had been withdrawn from my trust to pay for a kitchen remodel, bathroom upgrades, and the addition of a master suite. Improvements that primarily benefited Patricia and my father, but that had been justified as maintaining the family residence for the beneficiary's benefit. The irony was devastating, they'd used my money to improve a house I was now being forced to leave. Most egregiously, my father had been paying himself an annual trustee management fee of $25,000, money that was supposedly compensation for the time and expertise he devoted to managing my inheritance. This fee was far above the standard rates for trust administration and had been increasing annually as if it were a salary rather than a service fee. Over 6 years, he'd paid himself $150,000 of my inheritance for the privilege of stealing the rest of it. The investment strategies he'd employed with my inheritance were particularly revealing of his true intentions. Instead of conservative, beneficiary-focused investments designed to preserve and grow the trust for my future benefit, he'd made risky investments in ventures that primarily benefited Derek. He'd used $200,000 of my trust money to invest in a restaurant that Derek wanted to manage, despite Derek having no experience in the food service industry. When the restaurant failed after 8 months, the loss was absorbed by my trust while Derek moved on to his next career exploration without consequences. Another $150,000 had been invested in a property development project that Patricia's brother was involved in, a clear conflict of interest that violated basic trust management principles. When that investment also failed to produce returns, my inheritance absorbed the loss while the family relationships remained intact. The pattern was clear. Risky investments that benefited the family's personal connections were made with my money, while any losses were my responsibility and any gains would have been shared among the family. The most damning evidence was found in email communications between my father and Patricia that the private investigator had uncovered through legal discovery processes. These emails revealed the calculated nature of their deception and their awareness that what they were doing was both illegal and morally indefensible. In one particularly revealing exchange, Patricia worried about my upcoming 25th birthday and suggested they needed to transition Ashley out of the house before she starts asking detailed questions about her trust. My father's response was chilling: "Don't worry about Ashley. She's always been too trusting and naive about financial matters. By the time she realizes what's happened, Derek will be established in his career and we'll have enough legitimate investments to cover most of what we've borrowed. She'll be upset initially, but she'll forgive us when she sees how well Derek is doing and understands that we were thinking about the family's long-term stability." Another email chain discussed their strategy for handling my questions about the trust. They'd prepared explanations about market downturns, administrative costs, and investment strategies that would justify why my inheritance was smaller than expected. They'd even discussed presenting fabricated account statements that would show lower balances and poor investment performance to explain the missing money. The correspondence also revealed that Derek was fully aware of the source of his financial support. Far from being an innocent beneficiary of his parents' generosity, he'd been actively participating in discussions about how to use Ashley's money to fund his various ventures and lifestyle choices. In one text message to my father, Derek had written, "Can we use more of Ashley's trust money for the down payment on the house? Hannah and I found a place we really love, but we need another $50,000 to make it work." My father's reply was equally damning: "I'll make the transfer this week. We need to be more careful about documentation though. Ashley's birthday is coming up and we don't want any red flags when she gains access to the accounts." This exchange alone proved that Derek was a willing participant in the theft of my inheritance, not an unknowing beneficiary of family generosity. The private investigator had also uncovered evidence that my stepmother Patricia had been using my inheritance money for her personal expenses, including plastic surgery procedures, luxury vacations, and high-end shopping that she'd hidden from my father. She'd convinced him to give her access to the trust account for household management purposes and had been systematically withdrawing money for personal use while covering her tracks with falsified expense reports. The total amount stolen from my trust was staggering. Over $800,000 had been withdrawn over 6 years for expenses that had no legitimate connection to my education, housing, or career development. When combined with poor investment decisions and excessive administrative fees, my $1.5 million inheritance had been reduced to less than $400,000, and even that remaining balance was tied up in risky investments that might never recover their value. But perhaps the most painful discovery was evidence that this theft had been planned from the beginning. Email records showed that within months of my grandmother's death, Patricia and my father were already discussing how to maximize the trust's benefit to the entire family and ensure that Derek isn't disadvantaged by Ashley's inheritance. They'd viewed my grandmother's generous gift to me as a family resource to be distributed according to their preferences, rather than a specific bequest intended to secure my financial future. The betrayal was so complete and systematic that it transformed my understanding of virtually every family interaction over the past 6 years. Every time they'd praised Derek's achievements, they'd been celebrating success built on stolen money. Every time they'd lectured me about financial responsibility, they'd been gaslighting me while spending my inheritance. Every time they'd positioned Derek as the favored child, they'd been using my own money to create the very disparities that made him seem more successful. As I reviewed the evidence with my attorney, I realized that my family's attempt to force me out of the house was their last desperate attempt to prevent me from discovering the full scope of their theft. But they'd made a critical mistake. By trying to remove me before my 25th birthday, they'd triggered my investigation at exactly the right time to gather evidence and take legal action while I still had inheritance left to recover. Armed with overwhelming evidence of systematic theft and breach of fiduciary duty, I knew that my family's crimes demanded more than a confrontational family meeting. They required serious legal consequences that would both recover my stolen inheritance and ensure that my father, Patricia, and Derek faced appropriate punishment for their betrayal. The decision to pursue criminal charges wasn't easy, but the scope of their theft and the calculated nature of their deception left me no choice but to seek justice through the legal system. My attorney, Sarah Chen, specialized in trust and estate litigation and had handled numerous cases involving trustee malfeasance. After reviewing the evidence my private investigator had gathered, she was shocked by the brazenness of the theft and the sophisticated methods my father had used to cover his tracks. In 20 years of practice, she told me, I've rarely seen a case where the trustee showed such deliberate disregard for his fiduciary duties while maintaining such detailed documentation of his crimes. The legal strategy was multifaceted and devastating. First, we filed a civil lawsuit against my father for breach of fiduciary duty, demanding full restitution of stolen funds plus interest, penalties, and attorney fees. The lawsuit included detailed documentation of every improper withdrawal, investment, and fee, painting a clear picture of systematic embezzlement that had reduced my inheritance by more than half. But the civil suit was just the beginning of their legal troubles. Simultaneously, we reported the theft to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. My father's status as a licensed CPA made his crimes particularly serious, as he'd used his professional expertise to commit sophisticated financial fraud. The criminal charges included embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and money laundering felonies that carried significant prison time and would result in the automatic revocation of his professional licenses. But we didn't stop with my father. Patricia's participation in the theft, evidenced by her emails and unauthorized withdrawals for personal expenses, made her liable for conspiracy charges and civil damages. Derek's knowing participation in spending money he knew was stolen from my trust made him liable for both criminal charges of receiving stolen property and civil claims for restitution of the money he'd personally benefited from. The timing of our legal action was strategically perfect. My 25th birthday was still 6 weeks away, which meant my father was still serving as trustee when we filed the lawsuit. This gave us the legal standing to demand immediate forensic accounting of all trust assets and to seek emergency court orders freezing all accounts to prevent further theft. The court granted our emergency motions within 48 hours, effectively cutting off my family's access to the remaining inheritance money. The forensic accounting process revealed even more extensive theft than we'd initially discovered. The court-appointed financial expert found evidence of additional unreported withdrawals, hidden investment losses, and fabricated expense records that brought the total theft to over $950,000. My father had been so confident in his ability to manipulate me and cover his tracks that he'd kept detailed records of his crimes, apparently believing he'd never be held accountable. The media attention that followed the criminal charges was swift and devastating to my family's reputation. Local news outlets picked up the story of a CPA who'd stolen his daughter's inheritance to fund his stepson's lifestyle, and the coverage was uniformly negative. My father's professional reputation was destroyed overnight, and his accounting firm immediately suspended him pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Patricia's position as a volunteer board member for several local charities became untenable as organizations distanced themselves from the scandal. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings was watching Derek's comfortable world come crashing down around him. The house he'd been planning to buy with Hannah fell through when the seller learned about the criminal investigation and the likelihood that Derek would have to repay the stolen money he'd used for the down payment. His employer at the car dealership terminated him when the criminal charges became public, citing concerns about employing someone involved in financial crimes. The emergency court orders had immediate practical consequences for Derek's living situation. The judge ruled that since Derek had been living rent-free in our family home using money stolen from my trust, he had no legitimate claim to continued residence there. Derek and his pregnant girlfriend were given 30 days to find alternative housing, effectively reversing the forced relocation my family had planned for me. Hannah's reaction to learning about Derek's involvement in the theft was swift and brutal. She'd been unaware that the comfortable lifestyle Derek had provided was funded by stolen money, and she was horrified to discover that her boyfriend was facing felony charges that could result in years in prison. Their relationship ended within days of the criminal charges being filed, and Hannah moved back in with her parents, taking with her any dreams Derek might have had of playing house with a ready-made family. The psychological impact on my family was as devastating as the legal consequences. My father, who'd spent decades building a reputation as a trustworthy financial professional, watched his career and public standing disintegrate in a matter of weeks. The man who'd lectured me about financial responsibility was facing bankruptcy, criminal conviction, and the loss of everything he'd worked to build. The irony was perfect. In trying to secure Derek's future by stealing my inheritance, he destroyed his own future and left Derek worse off than if he'd never interfered. Patricia's reaction was predictably self-serving. She attempted to distance herself from the theft by claiming she'd been manipulated by my father and had no knowledge of the illegal nature of the financial transfers. But the email evidence and her personal withdrawals from my trust account made these denials laughable. Her attempts to portray herself as another victim of my father's financial crimes only served to highlight her calculating nature and complete lack of genuine remorse. The criminal prosecution moved quickly because the evidence was so overwhelming. My father's detailed financial records had essentially created a complete confession of his crimes, and there was no realistic possibility of claiming the theft was accidental or unauthorized. The district attorney's office was particularly motivated to pursue the case because of the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the abuse of professional trust involved. Within 3 months of filing the initial lawsuit, my father had agreed to a plea bargain that included full restitution, a 5-year prison sentence, and permanent revocation of his CPA license. Patricia accepted a plea deal for conspiracy charges that included 2 years in prison and joint liability for restitution payments. Derek initially tried to fight the charges, claiming he'd been unaware that the money was stolen, but the text message evidence made his defense impossible to maintain. The civil recovery process was equally successful. The court ordered the immediate liquidation of assets that had been purchased with my stolen inheritance, including Derek's car, jewelry that Patricia had bought for herself, and investment accounts that my father had established using my trust money. The family home was placed into receivership to be sold, with the proceeds going toward restitution payments. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the complete reversal of the family dynamic that had oppressed me for so many years. The golden boy who'd been favored and supported at my expense was now facing prison time and financial ruin. The parents who'd portrayed my modest lifestyle as evidence of personal failure were now facing bankruptcy and public disgrace. The family that had tried to steal my future had instead destroyed their own. As I sat in my attorney's office, reviewing the final settlement documents that would restore most of my stolen inheritance, I realized that my family's betrayal had inadvertently given me something more valuable than money, the knowledge that I could stand up for myself, fight for justice, and emerge stronger from even the most devastating betrayal. They'd tried to steal my future, but instead they'd forced me to discover my own strength and resilience. The 6 months following the criminal charges were a masterclass in watching carefully constructed lies unravel with devastating consequences for everyone involved. As news of the embezzlement scandal spread throughout our community, the ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate family to destroy relationships, reputations, and financial stability that had taken decades to build. My father's professional network, Patricia's social circle, and Derek's comfortable lifestyle all crumbled under the weight of their shared crimes. My father's accounting firm, Harrison & Associates, was forced to undergo an intensive audit by the state licensing board to determine whether other clients had been victims of similar theft. The investigation revealed that while my trust was the only account he directly embezzled from, his professional judgment had been compromised for years by his personal financial pressures. Several clients discovered that investment advice he'd given them had been influenced by his need to generate quick returns to cover the money he'd stolen from my inheritance. The firm lost over 60% of its clients within 4 months of the scandal breaking. Business owners who'd trusted my father with their financial planning were horrified to learn that their advisor had been systematically stealing from his own daughter while counseling them about fiscal responsibility and family financial security. The professional licenses of his business partners were also suspended pending investigation, effectively destroying a practice that had taken 25 years to build. Patricia's world collapsed even more dramatically because her entire social identity had been built on her image as a successful blended family matriarch and community volunteer. The charitable organizations where she'd served on boards quickly demanded her resignation, and her circle of wealthy friends abandoned her with the same ruthless efficiency she'd once used to exclude people she deemed unworthy of her attention. The woman who'd spent years positioning herself as a pillar of community respectability became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances. The social media reaction was particularly brutal for Patricia, who'd spent years cultivating an image of family perfection on Facebook and Instagram. Comment sections on her posts filled with people expressing shock and disgust at her betrayal of her stepdaughter, and many former friends shared stories of their own suspicions about Patricia's character that they'd previously kept to themselves. The perfectly curated family photos that had once generated envious compliments now served as evidence of the lies she'd been living. Derek's fall from grace was the most satisfying to watch, partly because he'd been the primary beneficiary of the stolen money and partly because his arrogance had made him so confident that he'd never face consequences for his actions. The criminal charges against him made it impossible for him to find employment in any field that required background checks, and his lack of genuine skills or work ethic made it difficult for him to succeed in jobs that didn't require credentials he'd never actually earned. Hannah's departure had left Derek emotionally devastated and practically helpless. He'd become so accustomed to having his needs met by other people's money that he had no idea how to function independently. Within weeks of losing access to the stolen inheritance funds, he was forced to move into a tiny apartment in a rundown part of town, surviving on minimum-wage jobs and government assistance. The man who'd once lounged in my bedroom doorway, smugly directing the packing of my belongings, was now working double shifts at a fast food restaurant just to make rent. The forced sale of the family home was particularly devastating because it represented the physical destruction of everything my father and Patricia had worked to build. The house that had been partially renovated with my stolen inheritance was sold at a significant loss because the legal complications surrounding the theft made it difficult to find qualified buyers. The proceeds from the sale went directly toward restitution payments, leaving my father and Patricia with no assets and significant remaining debt obligations. But the psychological impact of their downfall was even more damaging than the financial consequences. My father, who'd spent his career advising clients about long-term financial planning and responsible money management, was forced to confront the reality that his own financial crimes had destroyed not only his professional reputation but also his family's security and stability. The man who'd lectured me about making smart financial choices was now facing bankruptcy and years in prison because of his spectacularly poor financial and moral decisions. Patricia's mental health deteriorated rapidly as the full scope of the social and legal consequences became clear. The woman who'd been so concerned about appearances and social standing was now the subject of gossip and judgment everywhere she went in our small community. She'd lost her marriage, her home, her social circle, and her future in one spectacular implosion that she'd orchestrated through her own greed and cruelty. The plea bargaining process revealed additional layers of deception that made their crimes even more heinous. During their interviews with prosecutors, it became clear that they'd been planning to blame me for the missing inheritance money when I turned 25 and gained access to the accounts. They'd prepared explanations about my poor financial decisions and unrealistic expectations that would have made me responsible for the theft they'd committed. The plan had been to present me with fabricated account statements showing poor investment performance and high administrative costs, while gaslighting me into believing that my inheritance had been legitimately depleted through market forces and my own lack of financial sophistication. They'd intended to make me feel guilty for questioning their management of the trust and grateful for whatever small amount remained after 6 years of systematic theft. This revelation was particularly infuriating because it demonstrated the extent to which they'd been willing to psychologically abuse me to cover up their crimes. Not only had they stolen my inheritance, but they'd planned to make me believe that I was somehow responsible for the theft. The gaslighting and manipulation I'd endured for years hadn't been just about family favoritism, it had been preparation for the ultimate betrayal they'd been planning since my grandmother's death. The sentencing hearings provided me with the opportunity to address the court about the impact of their crimes on my life and future. I spoke about the years of financial stress I'd endured while working multiple jobs to pay for expenses that should have been covered by my inheritance. I described the psychological damage of being constantly compared unfavorably to Derek while my own money was being used to create his advantages. I explained how their theft had forced me to make career and life decisions based on financial limitations that were entirely artificial. But I also spoke about the unexpected strength and resilience I'd discovered through fighting for justice. Their betrayal had forced me to develop skills and confidence I might never have found if I'd simply accepted their version of reality. The legal battle had taught me to advocate for myself, to trust my instincts when something seemed wrong, and to refuse to accept unfair treatment even from people I loved. The judge was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, noting that trust and estate theft represented one of the most despicable forms of financial crime because it targeted victims who were specifically meant to be protected by the perpetrators. She emphasized that my father's abuse of his professional credentials and fiduciary responsibilities made his crimes especially serious, and that the systematic nature of the theft demonstrated a level of premeditation that warranted the maximum possible sentence. My father received 6 years in federal prison, 2 years longer than the plea agreement had initially specified, because additional evidence of financial manipulation had emerged during the investigation. Patricia received 3 years, with the possibility of early release contingent on her cooperation with ongoing asset recovery efforts. Derek received 18 months in minimum security prison followed by 5 years of probation with strict financial monitoring requirements. The restitution orders were comprehensive and punitive. In addition to repaying the stolen money with interest, they were required to surrender any assets that had been purchased with inheritance funds, pay my legal fees, and submit to ongoing financial monitoring for the remainder of their sentences. The court also ordered them to make monthly restitution payments for 15 years after their release, ensuring that the consequences of their crimes would follow them for decades. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their sentencing was the requirement that they publicly acknowledge their crimes and apologize to me in court. Hearing my father admit that he'd systematically stolen from his daughter's inheritance to fund his stepson's lifestyle, and watching Patricia confess to her role in the conspiracy, provided a level of closure and validation that no amount of money could have purchased. Derek's courtroom apology was particularly pathetic, as he attempted to portray himself as a naive victim who hadn't fully understood the source of his family's generosity. His claims of ignorance were undermined by the text message evidence showing his active participation in planning how to use Ashley's money, and his attempt to garner sympathy only highlighted his continued refusal to take full responsibility for his actions. The asset recovery process continued for months after their sentencing, as forensic accountants tracked down hidden accounts, recovered property that had been purchased with stolen funds, and liquidated investments to maximize restitution payments. The thoroughness of the financial investigation ensured that virtually every dollar they'd stolen was accounted for and recovered, plus interest and penalties that increased the total recovery significantly. When the final restitution payment was made, I'd recovered over $1.2 million of my original $1.5 million inheritance, more than the $800,000 that had been directly stolen because of the interest, penalties, and asset appreciation that had occurred during the legal proceedings. The criminal prosecution had not only punished their crimes but had actually resulted in a better financial outcome than if they'd never stolen the money in the first place. The community response to their convictions was overwhelmingly supportive of me and condemnatory of their actions. Local media coverage positioned me as a courageous young woman who'd stood up to family corruption, while they were portrayed as cautionary examples of how greed and favoritism could destroy families. The contrast between their public disgrace and my vindication was stark and satisfying. But the most meaningful outcome wasn't the financial recovery or the criminal convictions, it was the complete reversal of the family dynamic that had oppressed me for so many years. The parents who'd treated me as less deserving than Derek were now convicted felons serving prison sentences for stealing from me. The stepbrother who'd been positioned as the family's golden child was now an ex-convict struggling to survive on minimum wage. The family hierarchy that had placed me at the bottom was permanently inverted by the consequences of their own crimes. As I stood outside the courthouse after their final sentencing hearing, I realized that their attempt to steal my future had actually secured it in ways they never could have anticipated. The inheritance they'd tried to redirect to Derek was now safely in my control, along with additional funds from penalties and asset recovery. More importantly, I'd gained the confidence and legal knowledge to protect myself from future manipulation, and the personal strength that comes from successfully fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. 2 years after discovering my family packing my belongings to steal my room while they stole my inheritance, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The criminal convictions were final, the restitution payments were complete, and I was finally living the life my grandmother had intended for me when she left me that generous inheritance. But more than the financial security, I'd gained something invaluable, the knowledge that I could fight for myself and win, even against people who were supposed to love and protect me. The recovered inheritance money allowed me to make choices based on my passions and values rather than financial desperation. I left my corporate marketing job to pursue a master's degree in environmental policy, using the education funds exactly as my grandmother had intended. The degree opened doors to work with international conservation organizations, and I spent 6 months working on sustainable development projects in Costa Rica. Travel that would have been impossible under the financial constraints I'd lived with for years. Upon returning to the United States, I used part of my inheritance to start a nonprofit organization focused on protecting young adults from financial abuse by family members. The organization provided legal resources, counseling services, and advocacy for people who'd experienced trust theft, inheritance fraud, and other forms of family financial betrayal. The work was deeply meaningful because I understood firsthand how devastating it could be to discover that the people you trusted most had been systematically stealing from you. My nonprofit's first major case involved a young man whose uncle had embezzled his college fund to pay for gambling debts. Using the legal strategies and investigative techniques I'd learned during my own case, we were able to recover most of his stolen money and secure criminal convictions against his uncle and aunt. The success of that case led to referrals from attorneys, social workers, and financial professionals who'd encountered similar situations but hadn't known how to help their clients navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges involved. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's betrayal had given me both the resources and the expertise to help other people fight similar battles. Their attempt to steal my future had instead equipped me with unique qualifications to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating betrayals. Every case we won, every dollar we recovered for our clients, felt like additional justice for what they'd done to me. The media attention from my family's criminal convictions had made me something of a public figure in the area of family financial crimes. I was invited to speak at legal conferences, wrote articles for financial planning magazines, and testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against trustee abuse. The platform gave me the opportunity to turn my personal trauma into systemic change that would benefit other vulnerable people. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching the long-term consequences continue to unfold for the people who'd betrayed me. My father's federal conviction had made him permanently unemployable in any financial profession, and his advanced age made it unlikely he'd ever rebuild a career after his release from prison. He was currently working in the prison library, earning less per day than I'd made per hour at my worst job, while facing years of additional restitution payments when he was eventually released. Patricia's social rehabilitation had proven impossible in our small community, where her crimes and the details of her manipulation were too well known for forgiveness or forgetting. She'd moved to a different state after her release, but her criminal record and the internet documentation of her crimes made it difficult for her to establish new relationships or rebuild her life. The woman who'd been so concerned about social status was now a social pariah wherever she went. Derek's trajectory had been the most predictable and pathetic. Without the financial support he'd received through stolen inheritance money, he'd proven completely unable to build a stable life for himself. He'd been fired from multiple minimum wage jobs for attendance problems and attitude issues, had accumulated significant debt despite his limited income, and was currently living in subsidized housing while working sporadically in food service and retail positions. The most devastating consequence for Derek was the loss of any possibility of a relationship with his daughter. Hannah had married another man while Derek was in prison, and her new husband had adopted the baby, legally severing Derek's parental rights. The man who'd once expected to play house in my childhood bedroom with a ready-made family was now a convicted felon with no family, no prospects, and no ability to support himself, let alone contribute to a child's upbringing. The contrast between Derek's current circumstances and the privileged lifestyle he'd enjoyed through my stolen inheritance was stark and satisfying. The young man who'd smirked while directing my parents to pack my belongings was now the one being forced to move frequently due to inability to pay rent, working jobs he'd once considered beneath him, and facing a future with no realistic possibility of achieving the success he'd always expected to have handed to him. But the most meaningful change in my life wasn't the financial security or career success, it was the peace that came from living authentically and surrounding myself with people who valued honesty and integrity. The toxic family dynamics that had shaped my early adulthood were gone, replaced by chosen relationships with friends and colleagues who supported my goals and celebrated my achievements without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. I'd also reconnected with extended family members on my mother's side who'd been pushed out of my life during the years when Patricia was consolidating her control over our household. These relatives had always suspected that something was wrong with how I was being treated compared to Derek, but they'd been told by my father that I was difficult and ungrateful, lies that had prevented them from offering support when I'd needed it most. My Aunt Sarah, my mother's sister, was particularly supportive during my recovery from the family betrayal. She revealed that she'd tried multiple times over the years to maintain a relationship with me, but that Patricia had systematically discouraged contact by claiming I was too busy or going through a difficult phase. The isolation I'd experienced hadn't been natural, it had been orchestrated to prevent anyone from questioning the favoritism and manipulation I was experiencing. The legal precedent set by my case had also led to significant changes in how trust and estate theft cases were prosecuted in our state. The comprehensive nature of our evidence gathering and the successful criminal convictions had created a template that other attorneys could use to pursue similar cases. Several law firms had contacted me to consult on cases involving family financial betrayal, allowing me to help other victims while continuing to build expertise in this specialized area of law. My romantic life had also improved dramatically once I was free from the constant stress and self-doubt that had characterized my early 20s. The financial security and emotional stability I'd gained through fighting for justice had given me the confidence to pursue relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than seeking validation from people who reminded me of my dysfunctional family dynamics. I'd met someone special, a fellow environmental advocate named Michael who worked for a renewable energy nonprofit, and our relationship was built on the kind of honesty and transparency that I'd never experienced in my family of origin. He knew the full story of my inheritance theft and criminal prosecution, and his response had been admiration for my courage in fighting for justice rather than judgment about my family's dysfunction. 3 years have passed since I walked into my childhood home to find my parents packing my belongings while my stepbrother lounged smugly in the doorway, and today I'm writing this from the home office of my own house, a beautiful 3-bedroom property that I purchased with my recovered inheritance money. The irony isn't lost on me that I now own more space than Derek ever had, while he's currently sharing a studio apartment with a roommate he found on Craigslist, still struggling to make rent on his minimum wage income. The nonprofit organization I founded to help victims of family financial abuse has grown beyond my wildest expectations. We've recovered over $15 million in stolen inheritance money for our clients, secured criminal convictions against dozens of family members who thought they could exploit their relatives with impunity, and created a network of legal and counseling resources that didn't exist when I was fighting my own battle for justice. Every success story feels like additional vindication for the choice I made to fight back rather than accept my family's betrayal. Last month, I received a letter from Derek, the first communication I'd had from any of my former family members since their sentencing hearings. The letter was a masterpiece of self-pity and manipulation, filled with claims about how much he'd learned from his mistakes and how sorry he was for his role in the theft. But the real purpose became clear in the final paragraphs, where he asked me to consider helping him get back on his feet financially because family should forgive and support each other. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who'd knowingly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of my stolen inheritance money was now asking me to voluntarily give him more money because we were family. The man who'd smirked while watching my parents pack my belongings was now claiming that I had an obligation to help him recover from the consequences of his own criminal actions. The entitlement and lack of genuine remorse were exactly what I'd expected from Derek, and exactly why I had no interest in rebuilding any relationship with him. My response was brief and final: Derek, you had access to nearly $1 million of my inheritance money over 6 years, and you used it to fund a lifestyle you never earned or deserved. The fact that you squandered that opportunity and are now facing the consequences of your criminal actions is not my responsibility to fix. I wish you well in building a legitimate life for yourself, but I will not be providing any financial or emotional support for your efforts. Please do not contact me again. The letter was a perfect example of how some people never truly learn from their mistakes, even when those mistakes result in criminal convictions and prison sentences. Derek was still operating from the same entitled mindset that had allowed him to spend my inheritance money without guilt, the belief that his needs and wants should be prioritized over my rights and that his family relationships came with financial obligations that only flowed in his direction. But Derek's request for money had also made me realize how completely our situations had reversed since that devastating day when I'd discovered their betrayal. 3 years ago, I'd been living paycheck to paycheck while Derek enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle funded by my stolen inheritance. Now I was financially secure and professionally successful while Derek was struggling to survive on his own limited abilities and work ethic. The golden boy who'd been positioned as superior to me was now begging for help from the sister he'd helped betray. The most satisfying development had been watching my father's attempts to rebuild his life after his release from federal prison. The man who'd once been a respected CPA with a thriving practice was now working as a bookkeeper for a small retail chain, earning barely above minimum wage and living in a modest apartment that he shared with another ex-convict. His professional licenses were permanently revoked, his reputation was destroyed, and his advanced age made it unlikely he'd ever recover the status and income he'd once enjoyed. My father had also attempted to reach out to me after his release, but his approach had been even more tone-deaf than Derek's. Instead of expressing genuine remorse for stealing my inheritance, he'd focused on how much the criminal prosecution had cost him and how difficult it was to rebuild his life as an older ex-convict. He'd actually suggested that I should feel guilty for pursuing criminal charges rather than handling the matter within the family, as if theft of nearly $1 million was a minor disagreement that could be resolved through compromise. Patricia's post-prison life had been the most pathetic of all. Unable to rebuild her social connections or find meaningful employment, she'd become increasingly isolated and bitter. She'd created multiple social media accounts under different names to stalk my online presence, apparently obsessed with monitoring my success while she struggled with the consequences of her own choices. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of circumstances rather than a willing participant in theft and fraud had fallen flat with everyone who knew the details of the case. The contrast between their current struggles and my thriving life served as a constant reminder that justice had been served in the most comprehensive way possible. They'd tried to steal my future to secure their own comfort and status, but instead they destroyed their own futures while providing me with the resources and motivation to build something better than I'd ever imagined possible. My work with the nonprofit had also connected me with my grandmother's legacy in ways that went beyond the financial inheritance she'd left me. Through historical research and family interviews, I'd learned that she'd been a pioneering businesswoman who'd overcome significant obstacles to build her real estate empire. Her decision to leave most of her estate to me hadn't been arbitrary, it had been based on her belief that I had the intelligence, integrity, and determination to carry forward her legacy of independence and success. The irony was perfect. My father and Patricia had tried to redirect my grandmother's inheritance to Derek because they believed he was more deserving and capable of success. But their theft had actually revealed that I was exactly the person my grandmother had believed me to be, someone with the strength and intelligence to fight for justice and build something meaningful with the opportunities I'd been given. The criminal prosecutions had also led to important changes in state law regarding trust administration and elder financial abuse. The comprehensive nature of our evidence and the severity of the crimes had inspired legislators to strengthen penalties for trustee malfeasance and create better protections for inheritance beneficiaries. These legal changes meant that future victims would have better tools for fighting back against family financial abuse, and that potential perpetrators would face more serious consequences for their crimes. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my recovery had been the personal growth and self-discovery that had resulted from fighting for justice. The shy, insecure young woman who'd been intimidated by family confrontations and afraid of disappointing people had been replaced by someone who could advocate effectively for herself and others, navigate complex legal challenges, and build successful professional relationships based on competence rather than accommodation. The family dynamics that had once oppressed me were now completely inverted, with my former tormentors facing the consequences of their own actions while I thrived in ways they'd never expected or prepared for. The parents who'd treated me as less deserving than Derek were now convicted felons whose opinions about my life choices were completely irrelevant. The stepbrother who'd been positioned as the family success story was now a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement and unearned privilege. So here's my question for everyone who's followed this incredible journey from family betrayal to ultimate justice. Have you ever had people in your life underestimate your strength and resilience so completely that their attempts to harm you actually ended up empowering you? Sometimes the worst betrayals force us to discover capabilities we never knew we had, and the people who try to steal our futures end up giving us the motivation to build something even better. My family's attempt to pack up my belongings and steal my inheritance had been intended as the final step in years of manipulation and favoritism. Instead, it had been the catalyst that exposed their crimes, destroyed their comfortable lies, and liberated me to live the life my grandmother had envisioned when she chose to invest in my future rather than theirs. If this story has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family betrayal, inheritance theft, and ultimate justice. Share this video with anyone who's ever been underestimated by their family or told they don't deserve the same opportunities as their siblings. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with family financial abuse or times when fighting back against injustice led to unexpected personal growth. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to triumph. Remember that sometimes the people who try to steal your future are actually giving you the opportunity to build something better than they ever could have imagined. Trust your instincts, document everything, and never underestimate your own power to fight for justice when the people who should protect you choose to betray you instead. The greatest revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's succeeding so completely that their opinions become irrelevant to your happiness and success.